Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 1 tight end rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, as if the tight end position wasn't already difficult enough to rank based on the touchdown dependency and lack of targets at the position, we now have to already deal with injuries in Week 1 from prospects such as Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, and George Kittle, players that are at the very top echelon of the position. Nonetheless, over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about my top 16 ranked tight ends. Of course, giving you guys my thought process and opinions regarding these players. And of course, the statistics I've gone ahead and gathered in regards to these players in order to justify their current rankings. A couple things to keep in mind. All statistics that I mentioned over the course of today's episode are for a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. Last thing I wanted to mention before we get into these rankings, again, rankings are subject to change. Between now and Sunday, there can be a lot of different designations, whether it's players being limited to practice or potentially missing practice in the next coming days that could absolutely elevate or decline the overall potential ranking of a given player. In order to stay up to date on my latest rankings and content, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season in order to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. Later this afternoon, I will be live streaming prior to the Kansas City Chiefs versus Detroit Lions kickoff for the 2023 season. So if you have any questions, be sure to swing on by, try to help you guys out as much as possible. And I'll of course be live streaming on Saturday and Sunday this upcoming weekend to make sure that you guys are ready to go, setting your lineups to find success. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about some Week 1 tight end rankings. We're going to begin with Travis Kelce. The reason why I didn't produce this video yesterday and put it out to the public is primarily because I had a feeling that there was going to be a chance that Travis Kelce could end up playing today. If and when Travis Kelce warms up later tonight, and he feels comfortable, and the team makes him active for tonight's game, he is going to be in my starting lineup, and he absolutely should be in yours. Even if we don't get a 100% healthy Travis Kelce, and we find ourselves with 75 to 80% of his overall normal production, you got to remember, he's a tight end that over the course of the last 3 seasons, with Patrick Mahomes in the lineup throughout the regular season, has been averaging 15.5 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. So even with 80% of his overall normal production, he is absolutely worth the start. He's a player that hasn't missed a game due to an injury since 2013. I'm confident in starting Travis Kelce as long as he's active for Week 1. Now, I went ahead and designated him as my number 1 overall player, but if in fact we get into a position in which Travis Kelce is not active tonight, my new number 1 would technically be Mark Andrews. So going into this upcoming week, of course, this is another player that is currently dealing with an injury. As of the injury designation that was given to him based on his practice schedule from yesterday, Wednesday, he is dealing with a quad injury. My expectation is that Mark Andrews is going to suit up for this upcoming weekend's game. Of course, John Harbaugh pretty much confirmed that throughout the week of interviews in which they were asking about Mark Andrews and his health. He said he's not really worried about it. He should be able to suit up this upcoming weekend. At this current moment in time, the Baltimore Ravens are a 10-point favorite going into the Houston matchup. If, in fact, there's going to be a situation where the Baltimore Ravens are up by 2 to 3 scores, they would then pull Mark Andrews out of the lineup and not force him to play majority of that second half if they are leading by such a number. If they're not, he's going to be an active participant within this offense. You got to remember, over the course of the last 2 seasons with Lamar Jackson in the lineup, we're talking about Mark Andrews averaging 8.1 targets per game and 12.49 fantasy points per game in the last 20 healthy contests he's played with Lamar Jackson. Similar to the Travis Kelce situation, all we really need is 80% of what Mark Andrews does on a weekly basis, and we're going to find success for fantasy purposes and justify starting him going into Week 1. Hopefully, he's at a full capacity and gets a full practice by Friday. If and when he does, it'll give me even more confidence. Now, before we continue on with the other tight ends for today's video, a couple reminders. For those of you guys who want to continue to get more content outside of what I produce on the channel here on a daily basis, go ahead and travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match, but you're also going to get my rankings every single Sunday morning from my email directly to yours. Be sure to check your spam folder on Sunday mornings, which will include by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, and flex rankings in order to help you guys set your lineups every single Sunday morning. All you got to do is use the code, sign up, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10 once, and you're good to go for the entirety of the 2023 season. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible to take advantage of the opportunity helping me help you, be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy, and take advantage of the opportunity. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about our number 2. We have TJ Hockenson going into this week. Technically our number 3, if in fact Kelce plays, but nonetheless, TJ Hockenson takes on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Like I've mentioned all week long, we have seen Kevin O'Connell, formerly an offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams, with Sean McVay find a lot of success against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. The schemes in which they utilize and take advantage of Todd Bowles' defense has been apparent over the course of the last couple seasons in the 3 matchups in which we've seen Matthew Stafford and Jared Goff dominate that secondary. Now, as soon as TJ Hockenson joined the Minnesota Vikings last season, he was an immediate impact, averaging 8.8 targets per game last season with them, averaging 10.71 fantasy points per game. Now, when we talk about the matchup on hand, he is probably going to see coverage from Levante David, which is one of the better coverage linebackers in the National Football League. Even with that said, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers allowed the 9th most points to opposing tight ends last season. Their linebacking core of David and White has been the same over the last couple of years. So unless they bring a safety down to cover TJ Hockenson, I mean, honestly, I think he'd be able to take advantage of that opportunity. Either way, he's getting a high volume of targets and he's in an advantageous matchup in a game in which they should be scoring a lot of points as an offense. Moving on to our number 3, we have Darren Waller. As of this current moment in time, via Underdog Fantasy, he has one of the highest overall receiving yard totals amongst all tight ends. The expectation is that as he joins this New York Giants offense, he's going to be the #1 receiving target. And if that's going to be the case, I mean, he has demonstrated over the last couple of years as the =1 receiving target of an offense, he can absolutely find a lot of success. Now, even though the Dallas Cowboys last season were pretty stout in terms of stopping opposing tight ends, only allowing 6.32 half PPR fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends on a per weekly basis, I do believe that Darren Waller is better than majority of the tight ends at the position. He is going to make an immediate impact, and with the volume of targets that we're expecting, he should be great. Late last season, once he returned from injury with the Las Vegas Raiders from weeks 15 through 18, was averaging 4.75 targets per game and still averaging 9.83 fantasy points per game. You don't have to give him much opportunity, but if in fact they do, we're talking about 8+ targets, he should make an incredible impact for fantasy purposes. Moving on to Tyler Higbee, the thumbnail for today's episode. Tyler Higbee, in the absence of Cooper Kupp, should be the #1 receiving target of this offense. He should be peppered with targets all day long against the Seattle Seahawks defense, a defense that last season amongst all teams in the National Football League were allowing 11.71 fantasy points per game. The primary linebacker coverage should come from Jordan Brooks. We know that Bobby Wagner has rejoined the Seattle Seahawks, and he is pretty good in terms of coverage, but in terms of their nickel package, the linebacker that should be covering them should be Jordan Brooks. That's my expectation, and if that's going to be the case, Tyler Higbee should have himself a very advantageous matchup. Additionally, when we're talking about the fact that Tyler Higbee late last season, he took on the Seattle Seahawks twice. In both those contests, Matthew Stafford was not active. Now that you have Matthew Stafford available, we might see very similar numbers to weeks 1 through 5 of last year, where Tyler Higbee was averaging 9.6 targets per game and over 9 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. That's the hope, and that's why he's the thumbnail for today's episode. His current number of 46.5 receiving yards via Underdog Fantasy seems like an automatic hire in my mind. Moving on to our number 5, we have George Kittle. Like I mentioned earlier, George Kittle, he has been dealing with an injury. He did in fact log a limited practice yesterday due to the groin injury, which again is progress. Hopefully by Friday, he'll be at a full capacity. If that's going to be the case, should be good to go for the Pittsburgh Steelers matchup. Now, we know that George Kittle has found himself injured on multiple occasions. In the last 4 seasons alone, he has missed 15 games. So that in itself doesn't really surprise us if in fact he's in jeopardy of missing this week. But if in fact he's active, of course, we want George Kittle in our lineups. Last season with Brock Purdy throughout the regular season to close out the year, he was averaging 14.25 fantasy points per game. And there's a reason why George Kittle was able to set a career high in receiving touchdowns. It primarily had to do with Purdy and his utilization down on the red zone. If he's active, he's in our lineups. Moving on to our number 6, we have Evan Engram. Evan Engram takes on the Indianapolis Colts. Like I've talked about all week long, the Indianapolis Colts secondary and coverage is significantly less than what they were last season, losing Isaiah Rodgers and Stephon Gilmore. It's only going to open up more opportunity for this offense to take advantage of the middle of the field because they'll be so worried with trying to lock down guys like Calvin Ridley, Zay Jones, and of course Christian Kirk. So if in fact Evan Engram, who was peppered with a lot of targets in the 2 matchups against the Indianapolis Colts last season, in those 2 games, 8 targets and 6 targets. The first game led to 8.1 fantasy points, the second 6.5 fantasy points. Now take this into consideration. Last season, throughout that span of time, Evan Engram wasn't a huge part of this offense. He was actually pretty underutilized in comparison to where he was at the back end of the year. From weeks 1 through 12, Evan Engram was averaging about 4.7 targets per game and only 5.6 fantasy points per game, while from weeks 13 through the NFL playoffs all the way until they lost to the Chiefs, he was averaging 7.87 targets per game and 12.84 fantasy points per game. Now, even if we go ahead and take out that game in which he had 15 targets and 30 fantasy points against the Tennessee Titans, still averaging 6.86 targets per game and 9.86 fantasy points per game, I'm expecting Evan Engram to be a great play going into the Indianapolis Colts matchup. Moving on to our number 7, we have Kyle Pitts taking on the Carolina Panthers. Now, in the 2 matchups in which he took on his division rivals in the Carolina Panthers last season, in week 8, 9 targets, 5 catches, 80 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. for 16.5 fantasy points. An incredible overall week. Now, unfortunately, 2 weeks later, against the same defense, the Carolina Panthers, on a Thursday night football game. If you guys don't remember, it was a rain game, and obviously, he was given an opportunity, but Marcus Mariota was a mess that night. Even though Kyle Pitts had 8 targets, only led to 2 receptions, 28 receiving yards, and 3.8 half PPR fantasy points. My expectation for week 1 is that Kyle Pitts should see a high volume of targets. Going up against linebackers like Shaq Thompson, Frankie Louvu, these are not great coverage linebackers. So they should be able to take advantage of the opportunity unless they want to go ahead and put a cornerback on Kyle Pitts, which is definitely possible. But nonetheless, I think Kyle Pitts will see himself a high volume. It's just a matter of whether or not the quality of those targets are going to be there based on Desmond Ridder's overall play. We're just hoping that Desmond Ridder can elevate his game in year 2. All right, before we continue, a couple reminders. If you guys have not yet already checked out the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel. Again, I'm currently wearing the black tie-dye hoodie. For those of you guys who want to continue to support the channel, in regards to the 1.01 brand, greetings and salutations, you can travel down to the description of the video, check out andrewkirchhoffshop.com and support that way. Again, we're creating high quality, comfortable, and stylish clothes for your most stressful of upcoming fantasy football Sundays. So take advantage of the opportunity, support the channel. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you. All right, let's talk about our number 8. We have David Njoku. David Njoku takes on the Cincinnati Bengals. Last season in week 14 with Deshaun Watson in the lineup, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 59 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, 15.2 fantasy points, and a half PPR scoring format. Now, outside of that performance, unfortunately, David Njoku did not succeed much with Deshaun Watson, only averaging 7.34 fantasy points per game in the 5 games in which they played together. That being said, David Njoku should be the number 2 receiving option within this offense after Amari Cooper and ahead of guys like Elijah Moore and Donovan Peoples-Jones. If that's going to continue to be the case, and that was established as of the last preseason game in which they played the full first quarter with their starters, David Njoku, 2 targets, 2 receptions, 11 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. My expectation is that he's going to get himself utilization, hopefully down in the red zone, a big body target, and a primary receiving threat for this offense. Moving on to Dallas Goedert, our number 9. Dallas Goedert at this current moment has a number of 4 receptions and 40.5 receiving yards going up against the New England Patriots. Now, typically in the past, we'd be worried about the New England Patriots matchup, but last season amongst all defenses, the New England Patriots, they gave up a pretty good share of fantasy points to opposing tight ends, which was a 10.06 fantasy point per game average. In comparison to seasons past, Bill Belichick has typically just locked down opposing tight ends. Of course, last season wasn't able to accomplish that, so the expectation is that if in fact we're not going to see Dallas Goedert get shut down in this upcoming matchup, he should see high utilization. And if Bill Belichick wants to go ahead and target A.J. Brown or Devonta Smith as the guy he wants to shut down for the game completely, then Dallas Goedert should continue to benefit. You got to remember, from weeks 1 through 10 prior to the injury that he sustained last season against the Washington Commanders, he was averaging 10.2 fantasy points per game within this lineup. I'm expecting Dallas Goedert to get back to his normal self, healthy, ready to go, similar to what we saw in the Super Bowl. I'm expecting that 40.5 receiving number to go higher in this given week. Moving on to our number 10, we have Pat Freiermuth of the Pittsburgh Steelers. It is a very difficult matchup. In terms of an elite defense who can stop the run, the San Francisco 49ers are going to make it difficult for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And if that's going to be the case, it's going to force a lot of 3rd and long situations, 2nd and long situations, which will force Kenny Pickett to send the ball towards guys like Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, but of course, Pat Freiermuth. Pat Freiermuth last season in the games in which Kenny Pickett was healthy, in the 9 games that they played together, and Pickett was the full-time starter in those contests, he was averaging 6.86 fantasy points per game. We're hoping for touchdown upside, but luckily for Pat Freiermuth, he does take on Dre Greenlaw in terms of the primary linebacker coverage that is going to be in those nickel formations. We should see some success in that regard because last season amongst all linebackers, Dre Greenlaw was allowing 0.29 fantasy points per route run against him in terms of man coverage. So if in fact Pat Freiermuth is running a boatload of overall routes throughout this game because of the fact that they cannot run the ball, there should be a high upside for his overall potential. We just got to hope he finds the end zone. Moving on to our number 11. Speaking of finding the end zone, we have Juwan Johnson of the New Orleans Saints. Last season, he was super touchdown dependent. That was a given, but he also did not have great quarterback play with Jameis Winston and Andy Dalton. You elevate that overall play with Derek Carr, who has been extremely comfortable in utilizing his tight end position over the last couple years. I'm expecting Juwan Johnson to be the Darren Waller of this offense. And even though he doesn't have the traits and the overall speed and upside that someone like Darren Waller does, we're expecting a lot of utilization from the tight end position within this offense. Most recently, this offense designated Taysom Hill based on their official depth chart as a quarterback, specifically their third string quarterback. And if that's going to be the case, and Juwan Johnson will only have to compete with Foster Moreau and Jimmy Graham in terms of overall targets going into this upcoming weekend's game against the Tennessee Titans, who have struggled heavily in terms of stopping opposing tight ends, I'm expecting Juwan Johnson, very similar to last season, in games in which he was able to catch the ball 4 times or more, was averaging 12 plus fantasy points per game and a half PPR. If he's able to get to that number, find the end zone, should be a fantastic play. In fact, this entire defense in terms of coverage last season struggled heavily, mainly because they were so good at stopping the run and forced every team to throw against them for majority of the contest. Moving on to our number 12, we have Kmet, another player that, again, is quite touchdown dependent. In the 2 games in which he took on the Green Bay Packers last season, in the first game, week 2, only had 1 target, 0 catches, 0 fantasy points, was shut out completely. And then eventually we got Justin Fields far more comfortable within this offense. And from weeks 5 through 17, of course, Justin Fields was a completely different quarterback. And so was Kmet in that overall regard, being one of his overall main targets, averaging 4.54 targets per game, 3.54 receptions, 36.7 receiving yards, 0.55 receiving touchdowns per game, and 8.75 fantasy points per game. In the Week 13 matchup against the Green Bay Packers, 7 targets, 6 catches, 72 yards, and 10.2 fantasy points. My expectation is that DJ Moore is going to be the number 1 receiving option of this offense, but by far and away, the number 2 should be Kmet. If, in fact, Justin Fields continues to utilize him at a high capacity, going up against a division rival, I think this is going to be a great matchup for Kmet against Green Bay. Moving on, we have Chigoziem Okonkwo as our number 13. Chigoziem Okonkwo late last season from weeks 13 through 18, like I've mentioned before, was averaging 8.23 fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, in the games in which he was given 3 or more receptions, was averaging 9.17 fantasy points per game. My expectation for Chigoziem Okonkwo, now that we know for a fact that Ryan Tannehill is going to be in the lineup, in the 3 games in which he played with Ryan Tannehill from weeks 13 through 18 last season, 8.8 fantasy points, 15.5, and 8.0. All while in those 3 games, Austin Hooper was active in playing 48% of the offensive snaps or even more in those games. But throughout those games with Ryan Tannehill, averaging 5.3 targets, 4.7 receptions, 55.7 receiving yards, 0.33 receiving touchdowns per game, all for 10.76 fantasy points per game, all while Austin Hooper had himself 14 targets, 10 receptions, 123 receiving yards throughout those 3 contests. If all of those opportunities are going towards Chigoziem Okonkwo against the New Orleans Saints, even though it's a tough matchup, should have himself a solid week. Moving on to our number 14, it is Gerald Everett. A lot of people haven't talked about the potential impact of Gerald Everett within this offense since Kellen Moore has joined as the offensive coordinator. You got to remember, in the last 3 seasons, Dalton Schultz for the Dallas Cowboys was able to get himself, 89 plus targets each of those 3 years. Was extremely relevant the last 2 seasons, being a top 10 fantasy tight end over the course of those last 2 years. Again, if in fact we're going to see Gerald Everett be a mainstay in this offense, and they're going to run a lot of 11 personnel in which they're 1 running back, 1 tight end, Gerald Everett should be a great overall fantasy producer. Now, last season, including the playoffs, was averaging 7.94 fantasy points per game in the 17 contests that he participated in games in which he was given 6 or more targets, averaging 9.04 fantasy points per game, was able to accomplish that in 10 of his 16 overall contests, 63% of the time pretty much. Against the Miami Dolphins last season, week 14, 8 targets, 5 catches, only 28 receiving yards, but the volume of 8 targets wasn't by accident. Last season, amongst all teams in the National Football League, the Miami Dolphins were giving up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. They wanted to go ahead and take advantage of the opportunity. And if, in fact, Kellen Moore is going to continue to use the tight end position at a high capacity within his offense, Gerald Everett should find himself a lot of success. Now, speaking of Kellen Moore and Dalton Schultz, let's bring up our number 15, Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans. He signed with the Houston Texans this offseason to be a security blanket for C.J. Stroud, and that's the expectation. As of this week, they are 10-point underdogs against the Baltimore Ravens, and if that's going to continue to set pace, there should be a very negative game script coming along, and in the second half of this contest between the Houston Texans and Baltimore Ravens, Dalton Schultz should see himself peppered with a pretty good volume of targets based on the fact that they're going to be throwing for majority of that second half. So besides guys like Nico Collins, Robert Woods, potentially Devin Singletary or Dameon Pierce out of this backfield, another mainstay should be Dalton Schultz that should be playing on every single snap based on his proficiency, not only in terms of his route running, but of course his run blocking. He is a 3-down tight end, and I'm expecting him to be utilized as such. Last season, from week 7 through the playoffs with Dak Prescott under center, he was averaging 6.92 targets per game and 10.7 fantasy points per game in games in which he was given 7 or more targets last season, averaging 14.15 fantasy points per game. I know it's a completely different offense, different quarterback, but if you give this man opportunity, he'll find success. All right, the final player I wanted to mention for today's episode is Sam LaPorta, rookie tight end, who will be playing later tonight. Now, Again, if in fact Travis Kelce plays, Sam LaPorta is not on this list, as he'll be my number 17 next to Dalton Kincaid, who will be my number 18. I have hope that the Detroit Lions organization wants to utilize this tight end. Last season, amongst all teams in the National Football League, the Detroit Lions were number 2 in terms of tight end touchdowns scored. They had 12 receiving touchdowns from their tight ends, 10 of which were in the red zone and inside the 10-yard line. If in fact this game is competitive and it's a back and forth scoring contest, like it's implicated based on the total points, based on Vegas's overall number, we should see Sam LaPorta give an opportunity not only between the 20s, but hopefully down in the red zone. You got to remember Dan Campbell, the head coach of the Detroit Lions, a former tight ends coach, and of course, a former tight end in the National Football League. There's a reason why they brought in someone like Sam LaPorta. Last season, TJ Hockenson, from weeks 1 through 8 prior to being traded, was averaging 6.14 targets per game and over 10 fantasy points per game, playing 85% of the offensive snaps. We're hoping that's going to be the case for Sam LaPorta going into week 1. All right, guys, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Hopefully, this gives you guys more insight as to who you should be potentially starting going into week 1. Again, like I mentioned already earlier on today's episode, we will be live streaming prior to the kickoff of the 2023 season between the Kansas City Chiefs and Detroit Lions. So be sure to join us, ask questions in regards to starting your lineups. If you're not able to make it and you're seeing this later, be sure to go ahead, click the like button down below, subscribe if you have not yet already. We'll be making content tomorrow, the next day, and we'll have Saturday and Sunday live streams to make sure you guys are ready to go for week 1. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.